Hi, boys and girls. It's Mrs. Cutler here. I decided because it's such a gorgeous day outside, I was going to come outside today and do read aloud. So I am sitting on my back porch and kind of out here in the yard, and I am going to do chapter 3 today in Among the Impostors. So, chapter 3 today outside. Hopefully, the glare doesn't get too bad and you can still see me. Luke managed to keep up with Raleigh only because Raleigh slowed to a dignified walk when he began passing classrooms instead of sleeping quarters. But it was a fast, dignified walk, and Luke was terrified that Raleigh might dart around a corner unexpectedly and disappear. Then Luke would be totally lost, so Luke dared to jog a little bit, hoping to keep pace. A tall, thin man with a skimpy little mustache came out of one of the rooms as Luke passed by. "Two demerits, young man," he said to Luke. "No running allowed. You know the rules." Luke didn't, and he didn't have the nerve to say so. So Raleigh smirked. A thin man went back into the classroom. Luke knew he'd have to risk asking Raleigh a question. "What?" he began. But just then Raleigh opened a tall wooden door to one side of the hall, and he slipped through. Luke's reflexes weren't fast enough. The door shut behind Raleigh, and then Luke had to fumble with the knob. It was ornate and gold, and it had to be turned further to the right than all the other doorknobs at home. Home. For the second time in less than an hour, Luke was overcome with an almost unbearable wave of homesickness. "Stupid," Luke chided himself. How could he be homesick for doorknobs? Blinking quickly, he shoved the door, and it gave way. Blindly, he stepped in. He was at the back of a huge classroom. Boys sat in row upon row, dozens of them, and it seemed like Luke was all the way at the front of the room. There, the tall, thin man who'd just given Luke 2 demerits was writing on the wall. Or was it the same man? Luke squinted, confused. Oh, there was a door at the front of the room, too. That was the door the man had used. But had Luke and Raleigh really just walked so far between the doors? Suddenly, Luke wasn't sure of anything. Luke scanned the row of boys in front of him, looking for Raleigh. He was supposed to stay close to Raleigh, and so that's what he did. But now he couldn't even remember if Raleigh had brown hair or black, short or long, curly or straight. He'd really never looked that closely at Raleigh. He'd just followed him and gotten beat up by him. Any of the heads in front of him could have belonged to Raleigh. The man at the front of the class turned around. "And the Greeks were—" "Sit down!" he interrupted himself. He was looking at Luke. "Me?" Luke squeaked. Where should I sit?" His voice wasn't much more than a whisper. There was no way the man could have heard him all the way at the front of the room. Probably the boy sitting a foot away hadn't even heard him. But suddenly every boy in the room turned around to stare at Luke. It was awful. All those eyes looking at him, it was straight out of Luke's worst nightmares. Panic rooted him in that spot, but every muscle in his body was screaming for him to run, to hide anywhere he could. For 12 years, for his entire life, he'd had to hide. To be seen was death. "Don't!" he wanted to scream. "Don't look at me! Don't report me, please!" But the muscles that controlled his mouth were frozen, just as frozen as the rest of him. The tiny parts of his mind that wasn't flooded with panic knew that was good. Now that he had a fake ID, the last thing he should do was act like a boy who'd had to hide. But to act normal, he needed to move, to obey the man in front and sit down. And he couldn't make his body do that either. Then someone kicked him. "Ow!" Luke crumbled. Rough hands jerked him backwards. Miraculously, he landed on a corner of the chair, barely regaining his balance, and he managed not to fall completely. He slid to his right and solidly in his seat. "Thank you," the man at the front said with a mocking attitude. "See you after class." As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, the Greeks were quite technologically advanced for their time. Then Luke could no longer hear the man's words over the buzzing in his ears. His heart kept thumping, hard and fast. At least, Luke thought, it would be wise to run. But Luke resolutely gripped the edge of his chair. He was actually normal now, wasn't he? The boys who had stared at him slowly began turning back to face the teacher again. Luke wiped sweat from his forehead, and he looked around to whoever had kicked and pulled and shoved him. Had they been trying to help him? Luke desperately wanted to believe that, but all the boys near him were looking at the teacher nonchalantly, as though Luke weren't even there. And if they'd been trying to help, wouldn't they be trying to catch his eye and get him to say thanks? Luke really didn't know. He knew how his family would act. Mother and Dad, Matthew and Mark, Mother and Dad would never kick him, and his older brothers would be poking him now, taunting him. Who, one is to kick you? The only other people Luke had ever met before were Jen's dad, who was practically as big a mystery as the boy sitting next to him. And Jen. And Jen would? Luke couldn't bear to think about Jen. A bell rang suddenly, and it was such an alarming sound that Luke's heart started pounding again. "Remember, chapter 12, the teacher called as the boys scrambled up. Luke meant to go see the teacher as he'd been instructed. This had to be the end of class, but the tide of boys swept him out the back of the classroom before he quite knew what was happening. By the time he got his feet firmly on the ground, he felt like he might be able to break away. He could get around a corner and down another hall. He fought his way back to what he thought was originally the hallway, but then he couldn't figure out which way to turn. He looked all around, frantically searching for either the teacher or Raleigh. As nasty as he'd been, Raleigh was at least sort of familiar, but all the faces that flowed past him were strangers. Of course, the way Luke's mind was working, both Raleigh and the teacher could have paraded past Luke 5 times, and he might not have even recognized them. The crowd in the hall was thinning out. Luke began to panic again. "Get to class," an older boy standing nearby ordered him. "Where?" Luke asked. "Where's my class?" The boy didn't hear him. Luke thought about asking louder, but the boy seemed to be sort of like a guard or someone in charge, like a policeman, like the population police. Luke put his hand over his mouth, and he veered away down the hall. Another bell rang, and boys started running desperately to get to their classrooms. Hopelessly, Luke followed a group of 3 or 4 through a door and into a classroom. At least he thought it was another classroom. For all he knew, he might have circled around and gone into the same one all over again. Maybe that was good. Maybe after class this time, he could make it up to talk to the teacher. It was a short, fat man who stood up to talk this time. As confused and panically as Luke felt, even he could tell it wasn't the same teacher. Luke hastily sat down, terrified of drawing attention to himself again. He resolved to listen carefully this time, to pay attention and learn. He owed it to everyone, to Mother and Dad and to Jen's father, even to Jen herself. It was 10 minutes before he realized that the man at the front was speaking some other language, one that Luke had never heard before and didn't even have a prayer of understanding. Interesting, right? Oh my goodness, that was chapter 3. Our next chapter is chapter 4 in Among the Impostors. I hope you enjoyed that read aloud today. I loved it. It's so beautiful out here, and I can't wait to change my clothes. I'm going to get on my tractor, and I am going to do some more work in my garden. I'm trying to get my garden ready to plant this weekend. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will see you again for Read Aloud on Monday. Bye.